I have in my password. Yeah, so thanks a lot for coming to the talk. When Olivier invited me here, he asked me to talk about spoofing and spoofing mitigation. And for those who've heard me talk about this topic before, I think there's some in the room. Please bear with me. I'll try not to put you to sleep. There are a few new things in here that I've never presented before that are based on experimental results, but also I think it's still a popular topic. I'm going to DLR later this week, and I offered a lot of different ideas I could talk about: nonlinear estimation, remote sensing, ensemble Kalman filters, and they said, no, we want you to talk about GPS spoofing. And DLR is at least as good as me at that, so I guess there's some interest. Maybe they just want to make fun of me, I don't know, but anyhow. So what's all the big fuss? In 2008, Todd Humphreys developed this receiver spoofer based on software receiver technology that he learned while he was my PhD student at Cornell. And basically, it receives the GPS signals, it knows its geometry relative to a victim receiver, and it starts out by laying the spoofing signal, that's this black signal, right on top of the true signal, that's this blue signal, because it knows the geometry and knows what the true signals are. And it ramps up the power of the spoofer signal. These are the tracking points. This is basically code phase, and then this is amplitude of I and Q correlation. So this is a typical correlation function of a PRN code. And it ramps up the power of this spoofed signal, and this is the sum now of the true and the spoofed. And it's enough power that it captures the tracking points, and then it drags the spoof signal off to the left, and it's got enough power that it captures the tracking points. So now the receiver is tracking the false signal instead of the true signal. And this offset is the pseudo-range error that's induced by the spoofer. But it does this is just one channel. It does this to all the channels simultaneously in a way that's self-consistent, so that traditional receiver autonomous integrity monitoring that looks for unusual residuals in the pseudo-range navigation solution doesn't see them, because all the channels are done in a consistent way that makes this victim think it's in the wrong place or at the wrong time in a way that looks true. And there's no loss of tracking. And he published this at the ION 2008 GNSS conference, and there's been no end of interest in spoofing and detection since then, but things have gotten a little more interesting. In December 2011, the Iranians captured this RQ-70 stealth CIA drone. It was a very serious lapse for the United States. President Obama apparently convened a meeting in the White House to consider sending in commandos to retrieve it. They decided not to, because that would put us in a state of war with Iran, and I guess they didn't want to do that. But that's how serious this was. The Iranians claimed that they captured it by spoofing its GPS and telling it was in Afghanistan and landing at its base in Afghanistan when it was landing in Iran. There's a lot of doubt about whether that happened, but we're not 100% sure that it didn't happen. It might have happened. There's a lot of doubt, but it might have happened. Later the next year, Todd Humphreys took his spoofer to White Sands Missile Range with the blessing of the Department of Homeland Security, took this small UAV drone. It was under GPS autopilot trying to hover. He had the spoofer lie to it from about 0.6 kilometers away. So here's here's the spoofer, and here's looking south at the drone. And while it was thought it was hovering, he caused it to dive to the ground or to go veer left or right by spoofing his GPS. The next summer, he was invited aboard this 210-foot luxury super yacht. This is basically a billionaire's RV with a crew of 18 and quite an operating budget that's almost twice my total lifetime income, annual operating budget, with gold-plated sinks and all sorts of things. And he went on this. When he told me he was going on this, I said, Todd, that looks like James Bond could come up over the side, and if he does, in a wetsuit, if he does, you better be sure you're on the right side of the law. But anyhow, summer 2013, he went out on this yacht at the behest of the captain, who was allowed to invite scientific researchers on the yacht when the owner wasn't on it. And they spoofed its GPS. The drone was sort of an odd situation where, yes, the drone was doing funny things, but you could tell it was doing funny things. The goal with the yacht was to spoof it in a way where the people on the bridge would have no idea they were being steered off course. So it was gently steered off course so that the magnetic compass wouldn't register that, and the people on the bridge were completely fooled. Of course, he didn't steer it into any rocks or anything because he was friends with the owner. So what I want to talk about is spoofing strategies, a number of them, spoofing detection methods. I want to rank them sort of in a subjective cost of attack and detection strategies, talk about which detection strategies are appropriate for which attack strategies, then talk about what do you do if you do detect it. We don't want to just say, hey, don't believe your navigation solution. The reason we have a GPS is not to know that there's a spoofer there. We have a GPS because we want to know where we are. So can we recover a navigation function when all of a sudden what I call Todd Humphrey's Texas lying machine, or one of its cousins, is telling us lies about where we are? Can we find out the truth about where we are? I'm going to talk about recommendations for how to improve current commercial receivers to defend against spoofing. So here's one simple spoofer. The idea is here's a potential victim receiver. This is a personal privacy device that can jam this thing. You jam it, it loses lock on all the signals, and then you start broadcasting from a simulator, and which is programmed to send a false position. You broadcast a little more power, and this thing, when it reacquires, will because these things have more power than the true signals, will reacquire the true signals. This is kind of a klutzy spoofing because the victim loses lock and then reacquires lock, and it might get suspicious because of that. I put this up here because this is a very expensive simulator, but simulators are coming way down in price. So we're near the point where a clever high school student might do this in a year or two. I hope they don't, but because for a few thousand, someone might, with software or radio technology, might mount such an attack, and it doesn't require that much sophistication. So dangers are growing. Of course, we don't know that this will ever happen. It may be that we're worried about something that's never going to be done. Bad guys are never going to spoof this thing. Of course, this is just a review of Todd's receiver spoofer with just sort of adding a little bit of explanation to these things: total signal, tracking points, spoof signal, drag off. So it's what I showed before. And again, this is what got the whole tempest going. This is more dangerous than the one I showed you last, because in this kind of a capture, everything looks smooth, okay? The receiver doesn't think anything untoward has happened. It just said, oh, gee, I was heading straight south, and now I'm just drifting a little bit southwest in my yacht because it must be that the wind started blowing harder on me from the east. In truth, the wind hasn't blown harder on you. It's the spoofer, but you don't know. Whereas that jamming sequence where you lose lock on everything might alert you. But there are other strategies for spoofing besides those. There's something called meaconing. A meacon, actually, all it does is it receives signals, delays them, and replays them at a somewhat ramped up power so that the victim receiver will lock onto those signals instead of the true signals. If we just have one antenna at this meacon, this reception and replay, then this victim receiver will actually compute the position of the meacon receiving antenna. This is receiving antenna, spoofing transmitter antenna. So this victim will think he's here. In this fancy version of a meacon, you have a small phased array, and you steer different amounts of gain to different true GPS satellites. And then you replay each channel with a different delay, and now you can send this victim anywhere you want, not just to the location of this antenna. And because you're replaying delayed signals, they have all the encryptions. So you can attack PY code, M code, anything with this kind of a meacon. And this technology is not out of reach for a modest-sized company. I have reasons to believe these may exist, these small phased array meacons that could take an RQ-70 and steal it. Here's another kind of spoofer. To me, this was sort of wild a couple years ago. This is like Humphrey's spoofer, only it's got what I call true signal nulling in it. And so everything looks the same, except there's this black spoofing signal, there's this blue total signal, which because the spoofing signal is so low, that's basically the true signal, the receiver tracking points. But now there's this green signal, which is the nulling signal. And so the spoofer starts out under the true signal, ramps up power, but also this nulling signal is initially subtracting out from the spoofer, but eventually when the spoofer gets to power enough, this nulling signal's job is to subtract out the true signal. Now the spoofer drags the spoofed black signal off to the left, but leaves the nulling signal there at the negative of the true signal. So now there's hardly any residual true signal left to see, to the extent that this nuller can cancel it. Now there is a problem with this null. The reason I thought this was pie in the sky is you need to know where you are relative to that victim to a fraction of a carrier cycle, so to like centimeter level. So you need a very sophisticated sensing system to sense where this guy's antenna is. You also need to know exact total carrier phase that you're getting, not just relative carrier phase. So you need to know something about the phase of your mixing to baseband signal at the reception and you're mixing back up to RF at the transmission level. That's very hard to do. Todd Humphreys tells me he's very near doing this. Now, there are also issues about the gain pattern here. You need to know amplitude. There's lots of more things you need to know. It's much harder than the original Humphreys attack to put this green signal in a place where it really will cancel that blue signal. But Todd tells me he's near. This is more dangerous than the other one he talked about, which I'll tell you in a little bit why. And here's something even, so this doesn't exist yet, but I don't think it's so far away. This, I don't know that it exists yet, but this is dangerous for other reasons. Here, the spoofer may put a bunch of different little spoofers on drones above the victim, and each one may spoof an individual channel. So this guy is really only spoofing the signal from this satellite, this guy from this satellite, and so forth. And what that does is it creates a plurality of directions of arrival of the false signals. And one of the ways we're going to see to detect a spoofer is to look for odd things in direction of arrival. This kind of a spoofer, very, very expensive. But if somebody wanted to capture a very sophisticated airplane or a billionaire's jet or yacht, and they could throw millions of dollars at it, they might do such a thing. I'm not saying this exists, but it could exist. So how might we detect them? Well, the simplest detection technique, I think, was proposed by Dennis Akos, and that's just look at the total received power. So this is an actual spoofing attack. So Todd Humphreys, by the way, he got to go on the yacht in summer 2013, and he scared the captain so much that the captain wanted to find spoofing detection techniques. Todd sent them to me, and I got to go on the yacht 2014. And this is from tests on the yacht. So Todd sent a student to run his Texas spoofer, and then we had a spoofing detection system, a direction of arrival system, which I'll talk about later. So here's data from before an attack. Here's the power spectrum of the GPS band next to baseband. This is frequency in megahertz power. And the blue is during a spoofing attack. So obviously there's way much more power here. So if you just look at this power, you can tell something's gone wrong here. Maybe probably I'm being spoofed, unless it's a solar radio burst. But this is too much power even for a solar radio burst. And that's what Dennis Akos suggested. But there are other ways. This is a nice way because it's something simple you could do in the receiver. Another something simple, this is just in-phase and quadrature accumulations versus time. It's this, again, right at the onset of a spoofing attack. So here's the in-phase and quadrature accumulations from a DLL and a PLL, jointly tracking the signal. At the onset of spoofing attack, there's all of a sudden a jump in them, as all of a sudden the spoofer ramps up its power. It did it pretty quickly. And then so if you can catch this jump, that might be an indication that a spoofing attack is going on. Again, a pretty simple technique based on just signal processing changes. Here's again another, these are live, this is actual data from a spoofing attack. Here we have Doppler shift versus time as determined by a phase lock loop. This is at turn on time, so we have initial transient. And then a spoofing attack occurs here. This is the point at which the spoofer starts to ramp up the power, but it's still laying its signal right on top of the true signal. And this is the point where the spoofer starts dragging the victim away. It's captured the tracking loops, it's dragging the victim away. You notice there's nothing in the Doppler shift time history to indicate anything wrong happened here, because although you're being lied to about who is the right person, which is the right signal, you're not being lied to yet about where you are. Okay, so the wrong person is telling you the right information about where you are. At this point, the wrong person decides to start lying to you about where you are, and so they have to drag off your code phase, so they drag off your carrier phase too to be consistent, so there's a Doppler shift. So all of a sudden there's a sudden change in slope of the Doppler shift. So the slope is like the carrier phase acceleration, and it's about a 0.02 g, so it's a pretty small acceleration of the actual vehicle, but still there's a lot of jerk there. So that might be an indication of spoofing. Here's another indication. This is looking at the complex correlation function. So this is, again, this is real data from an attack aboard the yacht. So this is code offset versus amplitude of the correlation function. And we've calculated many, many taps. The red is for a spoof signal. The blue is for a non-spoof signal from the same, this is before spoofing. And then this is looking, so think of this as being code phase, in phase, and think of quadrature coming out of the board, out of the chart, on this one. And now this picture is looking in sideways here, just at quadrature and in phase. And notice that the non-spoof signal, basically this correlation function, when we look at it as a 3D thing, lives in a plane, as we think of as complex correlation. It all lies flat on a plane. But when we're being spoofed, it has this 3D structure. That's an indication of spoofing. Now, by the way, if I'd chosen this signal, I chose it from a special part of the spoofing attack. This is during drag off, when in fact it would have this 3D structure. There are other times during the attack when this thing would be more distorted and we wouldn't see the 3D structure. But you can look for this sort of thing during drag off. Later on, after drag off has ended and there's a wide separation between the true and spoofed signals, you can't see this anymore. But you can see this if you do many taps. Now, there's a problem with this technique, and that is that we have, it looks like multipath too. Now, of course, there are encryption-based defenses. There are PY code. There's a way to use PY code even if you're not a military receiver. You can cross-correlate the unknown PY code between a secure receiver and a potential victim. Or you can add new things to the signal. Navigation message authentication, or basically unpredictable navigation bits that after the fact you can post-dict them and figure out whether they were true. There's something like that, except it happens at the spread spectrum code level that Logan Scott proposed, and then after the fact a key is broadcast to you. You can go back and check whether that was true or false. This one is difficult though, because unless you're a military receiver, you don't have the proper keys. These two are difficult because you have the problem of you need to change the signals, you need to change the constellations. This one we can use right now, and I'm going to show you a test with this, but you need a lot of infrastructure to make this one work. So here's the type of infrastructure you might use. You have some sort of secure receiver that's listening to the satellite, using the CA code to track GPS, say, and then pulling off a part of the signal, the PY code, maybe doing some estimate. And then that sort of noisy version of the PY code, or parts of the PY code, it sends through some sort of link to a potential victim. The victim then receives a signal, does the CA code tracking, pulls off its own version of the noisy PY code, correlates it with this. If you get a high correlation, that's an indication that you're not being spoofed because they both have PY code. If there's low correlation, you don't. So here's actually one of those correlation functions. This is an actual spoofing attack from Humphrey Spoofer. This correlation is high here. We're not being spoofed. Here we're being spoofed, but we haven't dragged the victim off yet, and so the PY code is still present, so we have high correlation function. And then here's where we drag the victim off, and so the correlation goes low. Here's the spoofing detection threshold, and in fact, even though the spoofing detection statistic didn't dive down at the beginning of this spoofing attack, the spoofing threshold dived up, and if we're below the threshold, it's a funny hypothesis test, you got to be below rather than above the threshold to indicate an alarm. It dived up because it's keyed, it knows that the PY code power is a function of the CA code power, and the spoofer sent a higher power signal to capture the loops, and therefore the receiver thought the PY code power should have gone up, but it didn't. And so right here it delivers a spoofing alert. Here there's a little transient where it doesn't quite have the alert, but that's only because of beating between the true and the spoof signal. But for most of the time, we caught that thing immediately. But you need all this infrastructure of high bandwidth communication between the victim and the secure receiver that's sort of doing the noisy estimate of the PY code. There's drift-based defenses. If you know your oscillator has a certain stability, and you find out that as you solve for its offset, you find it's drifting way faster than the stability. That may be an unnatural delay introduced by a spoofer or by a beacon. That can be an indication of spoofing. Or if you have an inertial measurement unit and you see accelerations, your GPS starts telling you that accelerations are happening that are unphysically larger than your IMU says. Again, you could use that for a spoofing alert. Of course, you can use the two in combination. Then there's direction of arrival based methods. So you might have all these true directions of arrival. You might have a small phased array. This is like DLR is using. And you can actually measure these full vectors and see whether they have the diversity that you would expect from the true constellation. In the case of Cornell, we only need two antennas, and we don't ask about the full direction. We just ask about the cosines of the angles between these vectors and this vector, and we can also tell something about spoofing. If you're being spoofed from a single spoofing transmitter, in either case, all of the spoof signals come from the same direction, either at this two antenna system or this four antenna system. And with direction of arrival techniques, you can easily see that. And that's what we did on the yacht last summer, summer 2014. Here's what I call the Texas lying machine at the midships of the yacht. Here's its receiver antenna in the stern of the yacht. Here's its transmitter antenna at the front of the yacht. I call this the Black Knight. There's the Princess. This is the receiving antenna of the yacht. And there's, if you look closely, that's the water. That's the Mediterranean. It's nice to swim in June, but anyhow. There's the two antennas, just about 14 centimeters apart, less than a wavelength, of the Cornell spoofing detector. And this wire comes down to the bridge. And every time this thing captured the yacht's transmitter, we could see this. So here we have the differences for 7 different satellites. Here is the 2 antenna difference of the carrier phase, right? And this is actually the fractional part. So this is in cycles. So you can see there's this diversity of the carrier phase differences, which is fully consistent with a set of true signals. As soon as the initial attack happens, even before it's dragged us away to a false position, so we're still in the right position, even though it's the wrong person telling us that, this diversity is collapsed. Now, there's a little bit of wiggling here because the true and spoof signals are right on top of each other. They're beating against each other. And then, of course, as soon as the spoofer drags us away, this tightens up because there's no more interference between spoofer and true signal. But the spoofing alert is issued immediately because this diversity collapses because of directional arrival, lack of diversity. Now, it's also good to use complementary detection strategies because things like power, you might have a little bit of a problem of just looking at power, but if you use power, signal distortion, and drift, if you send in a lot of power, it gets hard to see signal distortion, or if you drag this victim away very fast, it gets hard to see signal distortion because you can only see it a very short time at the beginning of the attack. But if you look for a lot of power, then you force the spoofer not to use much power. If you looked for a lot of drift, you force the spoofer to make the initial onset of the attack slow. And during that low power, slow initial onset, you can use signal distortion to detect it. NMA is this method where you send these unpredictable navigation bits, but the spoofer might try to estimate them and replay them. That's called a securely code estimation replay attack. But you might notice that the spoofer gets the estimated unpredictable bits wrong at the beginning. If he can drift you away fast, he might have enough delay to not broadcast them until he gets them right. But if you're checking clock drift to make sure he can't drift fast, then he's sort of stuck with letting you see his dirty laundry, letting you see the fact that he's not sure about these bits. So these might work. With a directional arrival system and another method, which is signal reacquisition, you're constantly looking for new signals, you might find multiple versions of the same spoofed signal. So you might find PRN 2023, you see 2 different versions of them that are way above the noise floor, and so you realize there shouldn't be 2, there should only be 1. They're separated by way more and have way more power than you could explain by multipath. Then direction of arrival might help you to distinguish which is the true and which is the false. Now, this relative cost of attack strategies, it's not some quantitative 6 significant digits idea. The idea is that cost means cost of the equipment, cost of development, cost of the person, the sophistication of the people who it takes to operate this. And this is Todd Humphreys and my sort of subjective ranking. And again, this is not a complete list. But the idea that some kinds of attacks are simpler, meek-getting attacks, Todd's receiver spoofer, a jammer, an open loop signal simulator. I think a smart high school student might be able to do that in a few years. But then it gets tougher. Meekening is tougher, nuller is tougher, having multiple transmission antennas on a receiver spoofer is tougher, meekening with that, nulling with all that, it all gets more expensive, okay? So the truth is there are attacks that we can never defend against. This last one here, maybe we can never defend against it, but hopefully it's too expensive that we would never have to see it. But of course, also defense methods have their relative costs. So things that just involve different signal processing, different firmware and existing receivers like observables, power monitoring, looking at the correlation function distortion. These things are relatively cheap and could be implemented right now in many receivers. Drift monitoring, you might need to add an IMU. Again, an IMU for that. NMA, you start needing to change the constellation, so that gets expensive. Having to add all the infrastructure for this dual receiver PY code, unknown PY code, or having to have an authorized receiver, that gets more expensive. If you're trying to detect attacks, you have to make sure you're using reasonable detection methods. So for instance, If you try to use the traditional pseudo-range-based RAIN, looking for inconsistencies in the navigation solution, that's not going to work against any of the attack strategies I just showed you. Receive power monitoring, observable monitoring. If you have a receiver spoofer that's designed carefully, Todd Humphreys claims he can design this very carefully, that you will not see any of the telltale signs of spoofing. If you do a dumb receiver spoofer, then you will. With navigation message authentication or keyless cross-correlation or anything, any type of meakening is going to defeat that. Even a secure military receiver, somebody does meakening, they can defeat that. If you look for correlation function distortion, any kind of, if somebody can mount a signal nulling attack, you're not going to see that. And if you're using direction of arrival-based methods, but somebody uses multiple spoofer antennas in a clever way, you're not going to see that. However, there are also lots of valid ways. So if you use a lot of different signal processing techniques, receive power, monitoring, observables, drift, and correlation function distortion all together, then you can catch the spoofer if you catch them at the beginning. Any spoofer that only uses single transmission antenna, direction of arrival methods are going to catch them. Anything that doesn't use meakening or doesn't estimate security codes and replay them, you're going to catch them with NMA or symmetric key or delayed symmetric key. And that is somewhat incomplete list. This is a more complete list that Todd and I assembled in a paper we just sent off to an invited issue of the IEEE proceedings. Anybody who wants, this is an eye chart, but if you want to see the paper, I'd be happy to share it with you. But what do we do once, supposing we've successfully detected attack? We can say, warning, don't believe this navigation signal. And that's exactly what we did on the yacht. We were just trying to say, warning, don't believe it, don't believe it. But the truth is, we would rather get to the green light that says, okay, we've recovered authentic signals, the navigation fix is reliable. How do we do that? Well, we have to seek, once we realize that what we're listening to is a lie, we have to go back and find the true signals. That can be hard because the spoofer can act like a jammer. So you need to use weak signal techniques, but it turns out the spoofer may help you with that, because if the spoofer is sending you the true navigation data bits, you can do long dwell integration. Here's some, again, from an attack on the yacht. Here is, we're actually on our way to Libya. We burrowed 23 kilometers below Italy, and to get to Libya in 20 minutes, we're going 900 knots. It was a Jules Verne type yacht at that point. Here's the spoof signal in a sort of small code phase Doppler shift search. And at the same time, here's the true signal. If you look at the scales, we're 15 dB below the true signals. We integrated for almost a second of a coherent integration. But we could use the navigation bits off of the spoof signal to guide the coherent integration of this guy. So we could find this guy. Now this was done after the fact, but in principle it could have been done in real time. So just so one last point I'd like to make is, to my knowledge, nobody has anything besides pseudo-range-based RAIN in commercial receivers. And even though we don't know that anybody has mounted a spoofing attack, we don't know that anybody will, it seems to me that people should start to put simple things in there. Power monitoring, observables anomalies, correlation function distortion, clock drift monitoring. Those are relatively simple things. The only thing you might have to add is some way to take the analog AGC and send its gain to your digital signal processing unit. Why not put this in now? Why not lock the barn before the horses are stolen, even if we don't know horse thieves are around, if we can buy a lock for very cheap? This is the cheap lock. But if we start to think that it's more dangerous, then we might want to add fancier things. And by the way, there are systems, Novotel is a system where they could just change some firmware and have direction of arrival methods. But that firmware change is going to be more expensive. I think any constellation, if Galileo can add navigation message authentication, great, do it. I think you should do it. Why? Do it now. But GPS is probably harder. But anybody who can add navigation message authentication to an open source signal, I think that's great. A lot of people who do spoofing detection research never really get to the point of developing a precise hypothesis test. I think they should do that, because you really want to say there's only a certain false alarm probability, detection probability. And then eventually I think people should work on not just saying it's a bad signal, but finding the true ones and re-enabling navigation. Thanks for your time.